A shy waitress gives her umbrella to a stranger on the coldest night of winter, and the one who receives it is the billionaire owner of the entire restaurant chain where she's worked for 3 years without ever seeing his face. In her coat pocket, a crumpled resignation letter she never had the courage to submit. Yet this simple act of kindness will force them both to confront the loneliness they've been carrying in silence, and reveal that sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who feel most invisible. The snow began falling at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening in downtown Portland, Oregon. Not the gentle, picturesque kind that graces holiday cards, but the bitter, cutting snow that slices through wool, coats, and reminds you that winter doesn't care about your plans. Each flake struck the pavement outside Romano's Italian kitchen with the persistence of tiny, frozen bullets, accumulating in corners where the wind couldn't reach, creating small drifts against doorways and forgotten bicycles chained to lamp posts. Inside the restaurant, the dinner rush had finally subsided. The last customers lingered over their wine glasses, reluctant to step into the storm brewing beyond the fogged windows. The warm glow of Edison bulbs cast golden shadows across red-checkered tablecloths, and the air hung heavy with the scent of garlic, basil, and something indefinably comforting that made people want to stay longer than they'd planned. Maya Chen moved through the dining room like a ghost, trying not to disturb the living. Her black uniform was pressed and spotless, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun that revealed the delicate curve of her neck. She'd been working at Romano's for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days, but still felt like an intruder every time she walked through the front door. At 26, she possessed the kind of beauty that whispered rather than shouted, the type that revealed itself slowly to those patient enough to look beyond first glances. She cleared table 7 with practiced efficiency, stacking plates with the careful precision of someone who understood that invisible work was still work, that every motion mattered, even if no one noticed. The couple at the corner booth hadn't looked at her once during their entire meal, not when she brought their appetizers, not when she refilled their water glasses, not when she discreetly placed their check beside the breadbasket. Maya had learned long ago that this invisibility was both her burden and her protection. The restaurant held 43 tables, and Maya knew the story of each one. Table 12 was where the elderly man came every Thursday evening, ordering the same chicken, parmigiana, and leaving a 20% tip counted out in exact change. Table 18 hosted first dates that either bloomed into something beautiful or withered under the weight of awkward silences. Table 29 was reserved for the woman who came alone every Sunday, reading romance novels while she ate her way through the entire dessert menu. Tonight the storm had thinned the usual crowd to a handful of regulars and one stranger. He sat at table 4, the small 2-seater by the window that most people avoided because of the draft. Maya had noticed him the moment he walked in, not because he was particularly striking, but because he carried himself with the careful posture of someone trying very hard not to be seen. His dark wool coat hung on the back of his chair, expensive but understated. His hair, brown with threads of premature silver, looked like he'd been running his hands through it. He'd ordered the house special without looking at the menu, and when Maya brought his food, he'd thanked her with the kind of genuine eye contact that made her forget her practiced invisibility for just a moment. She guessed he was in his early 30s, though something in his expression suggested he'd lived longer than his years should have allowed. He ate slowly, occasionally glancing up from his plate to watch the snow accumulate on the window ledge. There was a loneliness about him that Maya recognized because she carried the same weight herself, the particular sadness of people who were surrounded by life but never quite part of it. Maya checked her phone. 10:23 p.m. Her shift officially ended at 10:30, but Romano's had an unspoken rule that servers stayed until the last customer left. She didn't mind. Her studio apartment across town held nothing but silence and a stack of community college textbooks she'd been meaning to open for months. The resignation letter in her coat pocket seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. A decision. She'd written and rewritten 17 times, but never found the courage to submit. The letter was brief and polite, thanking management for the opportunity while explaining that she needed to pursue other interests. What it didn't say was that Maya felt like she was disappearing a little more each day, becoming so accustomed to being overlooked that she'd started to question whether she existed at all. What it didn't say was that she dreamed of opening her own small cafe, a place where people would come not just for coffee, but for the feeling of being seen, where the woman reading alone on Sunday mornings would have a name, and the elderly man with his Thursday routine would have someone who remembered how he liked his chicken prepared. But dreams required money, and money required risks that Maya had never learned how to take. So the letter remained in her pocket, and the dream remained locked away in the parts of herself she never let others see. The stranger at table 4 pushed his plate away, leaving half his meal untouched. Maya approached with her practiced smile, the one that conveyed helpfulness without intrusion. "Was everything all right with your dinner?" she asked, her voice soft enough that he had to lean forward slightly to hear her. He looked up, and for the second time that evening, Maya felt the strange sensation of being actually seen. His eyes were a warm brown, tired but kind, and when he smiled, it reached all the way to the corners of his eyes. "The food was perfect," he said. "I guess I'm just not as hungry as I thought." Maya nodded, understanding the feeling of appetite lost to other hungers. "Would you like me to box it up for you? It's going to be a cold walk home." "That's very kind, thank you." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "You've been working here long?" The question caught Maya off guard. Customers rarely asked personal questions, and when they did, it was usually the kind that made her skin crawl. But there was genuine curiosity in his voice, not the predatory interest she'd learned to deflect. 3 years, she said, then immediately wondered why she'd been so specific. "Do you like it?" Maya blinked. In 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days, no one had ever asked her that question. Not her manager, not her co-workers, not the customers, who barely acknowledged her existence. She found herself answering honestly before she could stop herself. "I like the people," she said. "Well, most of them. There's something beautiful about watching strangers share meals, you know. Like you. Get to see all these little moments of connection that people think no one notices." The stranger studied her face with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable, but somehow didn't. "You notice a lot." "It's easier when you're invisible," Maya said, then immediately flushed, mortified that she'd revealed so much to a complete stranger. But he didn't laugh or look at her with pity. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if he understood exactly what she meant. "Invisibility can be both a gift and a curse," he said quietly. "You see everything, but no one sees you." Maya felt something shift in her chest, a recognition so profound it was almost painful. Here was someone who understood the peculiar loneliness of being constantly surrounded by people, yet perpetually alone. "I should get your food boxed up," she said, suddenly needing to escape the weight of his understanding. "Of course." Maya retreated to the kitchen, her hands shaking slightly as she transferred his leftovers into a to-go container. Through the service window, she could see him, sitting perfectly still, watching the snow continue to fall. The last of the other customers had finally braved the storm, leaving him alone in the dining room, except for the soft jazz playing from hidden speakers and the occasional clink of dishes being washed in the kitchen. When she returned with his boxed meal, he was counting out bills from a worn leather wallet. She set down the container and placed his check beside it, noting that he'd left a $30 tip on a $22 meal. Generous, but not ostentatiously so. "Thank you," he said, standing and reaching for his coat. For everything. Maya nodded, retreating to a safe distance as he gathered his things. She watched him walk toward the door, noting the way he moved, with careful deliberation, as if each step required conscious thought. At the threshold, he paused and turned back. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he said, and something in his voice suggested he knew about dreams deferred and chances not taken. Then he pushed through the glass door and stepped into the storm. Maya rushed to the window, watching as he stood on the sidewalk for a moment, snow immediately beginning to accumulate on his dark coat. He had no umbrella, no hat, nothing to shield him from the bitter wind that was picking up strength. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that swirled and danced in the streetlight, creating a wall of white that would make the walk to wherever he was going miserable at best, dangerous at worst. Without thinking, Maya grabbed her purse. From behind, the hostess stand and dug out her umbrella. It was small and black, nothing special, purchased from a discount store 3 years ago when she'd first moved to Portland and learned about the city's relationship with rain. She'd used it countless times, through spring downpours and autumn drizzles, and it had kept her dry through every storm except the ones that mattered most. She pushed through the front door, the cold hitting her like a physical blow. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and the snow immediately began settling on her shoulders and in her hair. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice barely audible over the wind. The stranger turned, snowflakes clinging to his eyelashes, his coat already dusted white. Maya held out the umbrella, suddenly feeling foolish but unable to stop herself. "You shouldn't walk home in this without protection." He stared at the umbrella as if it was something magical, something he'd never seen before. "I can't take your umbrella. How will you get home?" "I take the bus," Maya said, which was true. "The stop is right there. You need this more than I do." For a moment, neither of them moved. The snow continued to fall around them, creating a small pocket of intimacy in the vast, cold night. Maya could see something struggling in his expression, surprise and gratitude and something deeper, something that looked almost like pain. "Are you sure?" he asked. Maya pressed the umbrella into his hands, their fingers brushing for just an instant. His skin was warm despite the cold, and she felt an electric jolt of connection that had nothing to do with the storm. "I'm sure," she said. He opened the umbrella, and immediately the sound of snow hitting fabric created a small shelter above their heads. For a heartbeat, they stood together in that tiny space, close enough that Maya could smell his cologne, something subtle and expensive that reminded her of cedar and rain. "Thank you," he said, and the words carried more weight than seemed possible for such a simple phrase. Maya stepped back, immediately feeling the loss of warmth and protection. "Stay safe out there," he nodded, studying her face as if trying to memorize it. Then he turned and walked away, the umbrella a small black dome, moving through the white curtain of falling snow until the storm swallowed him completely. Maya stood on the sidewalk for several minutes after he disappeared, snow accumulating in her hair and soaking through her thin uniform. She felt strangely hollow, as if she'd given away more than just an umbrella. But there was also something warm spreading through her chest, a feeling she couldn't quite name. For the first time in months, she'd acted without calculating the cost, had given something of herself freely without expecting anything in return. When she finally turned to go back inside, she realized she was smiling. A shy waitress gives her umbrella to a stranger on the coldest night of winter. And the one who receives it is the billionaire owner of the entire restaurant chain, where she's worked for 3 years without ever seeing his face. In her coat pocket, a crumpled resignation letter she never had the courage to submit. Yet this simple act of kindness will force them both to confront the loneliness they've been carrying in silence, and reveal that sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who feel most invisible. The snow began falling at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening in downtown Portland, Oregon. Not the gentle, picturesque kind that graces holiday cards, but the bitter, cutting snow that slices through wool coats and reminds you that winter doesn't care about your plans. Each flake struck the pavement outside Romano's Italian kitchen with the persistence of tiny frozen bullets, accumulating in corners where the wind couldn't reach, creating small drifts against doorways and forgotten bicycles chained to lamp posts inside the restaurant. The dinner rush had finally subsided. The last customers lingered over their wine glasses, reluctant to step into the storm, brewing beyond the fogged windows. The warm glow of Edison bulbs cast golden shadows across red-checkered tablecloths, and the air hung heavy with the scent of garlic, basil, and something indefinably comforting that made people want to stay longer than they'd planned. Maya Chen moved through the dining room like a ghost, trying not to disturb the living. Her black uniform was pressed and spotless, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun that revealed the delicate curve of her neck. She'd been working at Romano's for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days, but still felt like an intruder every time she walked through the front door. At 26, she possessed the kind of beauty that whispered rather than shouted, the type that revealed itself slowly to those patient enough to look beyond first glances. She cleared table 7 with practiced efficiency, stacking plates with the careful precision of someone who understood that invisible work was still work, that every motion mattered even if no one noticed. The couple at the corner booth hadn't looked at her once during their entire meal, not when she brought their appetizers, not when she refilled their water glasses, not when she discreetly placed their check beside the bread basket. Maya had learned long ago that this invisibility was both her burden and her protection. She pushed through the front door, the cold hitting her like a physical blow. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and the snow immediately began settling on her shoulders and in her hair. "Excuse me?" she called out, her voice barely audible. Over the wind, the stranger turned, snowflakes clinging to his eyelashes, his coat already dusted white. Maya held out the umbrella, suddenly feeling foolish, but unable to stop herself. "You shouldn't walk home in this without protection." He stared at the umbrella as if it was something magical, something he'd never seen before. "I can't take your umbrella." "How will you get home?" "I take the bus," Maya said, which was true. "The stop is right there. You need this more than I do." For a moment neither of them moved. The snow continued to fall around them, creating a small pocket of intimacy in the vast, cold night. Maya could see something struggling in his expression, surprise and gratitude and something deeper, something that looked almost like pain. "Are you sure?" he asked. Maya pressed the umbrella into his hands, their fingers brushing for just an instant. His skin was warm despite the cold, and she felt an electric jolt of connection that had nothing to do with the storm. "I'm sure," she said. He opened the umbrella, and immediately the sound of snow hitting fabric created a small shelter above their heads. For a heartbeat, they stood together in that tiny space, close enough that Maya could smell his cologne, something subtle and expensive that reminded her of cedar and rain. "Thank you," he said, and the words carried more weight than seemed possible for such a simple phrase. Maya stepped back, immediately feeling the loss of warmth and protection. "Stay safe out there." He nodded, studying her face as if trying to memorize it. Then he turned and walked away, the umbrella a small black dome moving through the white curtain of falling snow until the storm swallowed him completely. Maya stood on the sidewalk for several minutes after he disappeared, snow accumulating in her hair and soaking through her thin uniform. She felt strangely hollow, as if she'd given away more than just an umbrella. But there was also something warm spreading through her chest, a feeling she couldn't quite name. For the first time in months, she'd acted without calculating the cost, had given something of herself freely without expecting anything in return. When she finally turned to go back inside, she realized she was smiling. The bus ride home took 43 minutes through streets that seemed to have surrendered to winter's assault. Maya pressed her forehead against the cold window, watching the city transform into something unrecognizable under the accumulating snow. Streetlights created golden halos in the falling flakes, and the few cars, still brave enough to venture out, moved with the cautious deliberation of ships navigating treacherous waters. She'd ridden this same route 1,247 times over the past 3 years, but tonight felt different. The familiar landmarks, the corner pharmacy with its flickering neon sign, the 24-hour laundromat where insomniacs gathered with their baskets of solitude, the bridge that spanned the Willamette River like a steel prayer, all seemed touched by something magical, something that made the ordinary world feel full of possibilities she'd forgotten existed. Maya's reflection stared back at her from the window, ghostly and transparent, overlaid on the snowy landscape rushing past. She looked like someone she didn't quite recognize, someone who had acted without fear, who had given freely without calculating the cost. The resignation letter in her coat pocket felt lighter now, as if the simple act of kindness had shifted some fundamental weight in her chest. The bus wheezed to a stop at Pine Street, and Maya gathered her things. The driver, a woman named Dolores, who'd been working this route for 12 years, looked at her with concern. "No umbrella tonight, honey?" Dolores asked, noting Maya's damp hair and snow-dusted shoulders. "I gave it to someone who needed it more," Maya said, and the words surprised her with their simple truth. Dolores smiled, the kind of smile that suggested she understood more than she said. "Well, you be careful out there. Storm's getting worse." Maya stepped off the bus into what felt like a different world entirely. Her neighborhood, usually alive with the sounds of late-night traffic and the distant hum of the freeway, had been muffled by snow into something resembling silence. Her footsteps created the first tracks on the sidewalk, and each step squeaked with the particular sound that only fresh snow makes when it's cold enough to protest being disturbed. The walk to her building took longer than usual, partly because of the weather, and partly because Maya found herself moving differently tonight, less hurried, more aware of the world around her. She noticed things she'd passed by countless times without seeing, the way snow collected in the cupped hands of the bronze statue in Meridian Park, the warm yellow light spilling from apartment windows where other people were living their own. Quiet dramas, the sound of laughter echoing from somewhere she couldn't identify. Her building stood at the corner of Pine and 23rd, a converted warehouse from the 1920s that had been divided into studio apartments for people who needed cheap rent more than they needed space. Maya climbed 3 flights of stairs, her wet shoes squeaking against linoleum that had seen better decades. The hallway smelled like industrial disinfectant and something cooking that might have been curry, and fluorescent lights hummed overhead with the persistence of insects. Maya's apartment was 3B, wedged between a nursing student who practiced, typing at all hours, and an artist who painted landscapes he'd never seen in person. She unlocked her door and stepped into the 47 square feet of space she called home, immediately feeling the familiar weight of solitude settle around her shoulders like an old coat. The studio held everything she owned: a twin bed pushed against the far wall, a small table that served as both desk and dining room, 2 folding chairs she'd bought at a thrift store, and a kitchenette that consisted of a hot plate, a mini refrigerator, and a sink that had been installed sometime during the Carter administration. Her books were stacked in towers against every available wall, creating a kind of literary fortress that made the small space feel even smaller, but somehow safer. Maya hung her damp coat on the single hook by the door and changed into dry clothes, flannel pajama pants and an oversized sweater that had belonged to her grandmother. She made tea using the electric kettle that was her most valuable possession, waiting for the water to boil while she stared out her single window at the snow. Continuing to fall, her reflection looked back at her again, clearer now in the glass darkened by night. She studied her own face, as if seeing it for the first time, noting the way her eyes seemed brighter tonight, more alive. Something had changed during those few minutes on the sidewalk outside Romano's, something fundamental that she couldn't quite name but could feel shifting inside her chest like ice beginning to thaw. The resignation letter sat on her table, where she'd placed it after removing it from her coat pocket. Maya had written and rewritten it so many times that she'd memorized every word, every carefully chosen phrase designed to express gratitude while concealing the truth of her desperation. She picked it up now, unfolding the single sheet of paper that represented 3 years of accumulated disappointment. "Dear Mr. Romano," it began, addressing a man she'd never met, who owned the restaurant but never visited, who existed for her only as a signature on her paychecks and a name on the door. "I am writing to inform you of my decision to resign from my position as server at Romano's Italian kitchen, effective 2 weeks from the date of this letter." Maya had crafted the letter to sound professional and grateful, the kind of resignation that wouldn't burn bridges or create uncomfortable questions. What it didn't say was that she felt like she was slowly disappearing, becoming so accustomed to being invisible that she'd started to forget she existed at all. What it didn't say was that she'd been saving every penny she could for 2 years, collecting tips in a coffee can hidden behind her books, dreaming of opening a small cafe where she could create the kind of place she'd always wanted to find, but never had. The dream felt foolish most days, the fantasy of someone who'd never learned how to want things properly. Maya had grown up in foster care, shuffled between families who meant well but never quite saw her as permanent. She'd learned early that wanting too much led to disappointment, that dreams were luxuries for people who had the safety net of belonging somewhere. But tonight, holding the umbrella out to a stranger in the snow, she'd felt something she'd almost forgotten. The possibility that kindness might be its own kind of currency, that giving freely might somehow create space for receiving. Maya folded the letter and placed it back on the table, but she didn't seal it in the envelope she'd already addressed. Instead, she pulled out one of her composition notebooks, the kind she bought in bulk from the office supply store, and opened it to a fresh page. She'd been keeping these notebooks for as long as she could remember, filling them with observations about the people she served, the conversations she overheard, the small dramas that played out in the dining room while she moved invisibly between tables. Writing had always been her way of making sense of a world that seemed determined to overlook her, a method of creating meaning from the fragments of other people's lives. Tonight, she wrote about the stranger at table 4. "He ate like someone who'd forgotten food was supposed to bring pleasure," she wrote, her pen moving across the page with unusual fluency. Not mechanically, but with the careful attention of someone who was trying to remember how to taste things. When he smiled, it started in his eyes before it reached his mouth, as if happiness was something he had to consciously choose rather than something that happened naturally. Maya paused, pen hovering over the paper as she tried to capture the feeling of those few minutes on the sidewalk. How could she describe the way he'd looked at the umbrella, as if it was something precious rather than something practical? How could she explain the electricity she'd felt when their fingers touched, brief and accidental, but somehow significant? There was something about giving him the umbrella that felt like the first true thing I've done in months, she continued writing. Not because it was particularly generous or sacrificial, but because for once I acted without thinking about the consequences. I saw someone who needed something I had, and I gave it to him. Simple as that. But it felt like the most complicated thing in the world. Outside her window, the snow continued to fall, and Maya found herself wondering where the stranger was now. Did he live nearby? Was he someone who worked in the financial district, one of those people who spent their days in glass towers, making decisions that affected thousands of lives they'd never see? Or was he more like her, someone who moved through the world quietly, trying not to take up too much space? She thought about the way he'd thanked her, the weight his voice had carried when he said such simple words. There had been surprise in his expression, but also something deeper, something that looked like relief, as if he'd been waiting for someone to notice that he needed help, but hadn't known how to ask. Maya closed the notebook and made herself another cup of tea, this time adding honey from the small jar she saved for special occasions. The warmth spread through her chest, and she realized she felt more awake than she had in weeks. Usually the end of a shift left her drained, ready to collapse into bed, and let sleep erase another day that felt indistinguishable from all the others. Tonight she felt energized, as if some dormant part of herself had been awakened by that brief moment of genuine connection. She picked up one of her community college catalogues, the one for business management that she'd been avoiding for months. The pages were filled with course descriptions that seemed designed for people who already knew how to dream big, people who had the confidence to believe they could build something meaningful from nothing. Maya had always felt like those courses were meant for other people, people who belonged in boardrooms and planning meetings, people who'd never learned to make themselves small. But tonight, reading about small business development and entrepreneurship, Maya felt something shift. Maybe she didn't need to have all the answers before she started. Maybe the point wasn't to have a perfect plan, but to begin with what she had and trust that the rest would reveal itself along the way. She opened her notebook again and began writing a different kind of list than the resignation letter. This one was titled The Cafe, and underneath she wrote everything she'd been imagining for the past 2 years. A small space with mismatched furniture and books on every available surface, a menu that changed based on what felt right rather than what was profitable. A place where people could sit alone without feeling lonely, where regulars would have their own unspoken tables and their stories would be held with care. Tables for one that don't feel like punishment, she wrote. Coffee that tastes like someone cares about your morning. A bulletin board where people can leave notes for each other. Plants in the windows. Music that whispers instead of shouts. A place where tipping well matters, but being kind matters more. Maya wrote until her hand cramped and her tea grew cold, filling pages with details she'd been carrying in her head for years, but had never allowed herself to articulate. The snow outside had stopped falling, leaving the world muffled and transformed, and the digital clock on her nightstand read 2:17 a.m. when she finally set down her pen. She felt different than she had that morning, as if the simple act of giving away her umbrella had created space for something new to grow. The resignation letter still sat on her table, but it no longer felt like the only option. Maybe there was another way forward, one that didn't require her to disappear entirely. Maya brushed her teeth and climbed into bed, but sleep felt far away. She lay in the darkness, thinking about brown eyes and genuine smiles, about the weight of loneliness and the lightness that came from unexpected kindness. Somewhere in the city, a stranger was staying dry under her umbrella, and that thought filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with her blankets. For the first time in months, Maya fell asleep smiling, and her dreams were full of coffee, shops and conversations, of people who saw each other clearly and chose kindness anyway. She dreamed of a place where invisibility was impossible, where everyone who entered was seen and welcomed and remembered. And in her dreams, there was always someone at table 4, someone who ate slowly and smiled with his whole face, someone who understood that the most profound connections often began with the smallest gestures. 12 miles across the city, in a penthouse that overlooked the Willamette River, like a glass fortress suspended between earth and sky. David Romano stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, holding a small black umbrella and trying to remember the last time a stranger had been kind to him without wanting something in return. The umbrella rested against his palm with surprising lightness, its fabric still damp from the snow that had finally stopped falling around 3 in the morning. David had walked the entire way home, despite having a driver on call, despite owning a Tesla that sat unused in the parking garage 37 floors below, despite having the resources to shield himself from any inconvenience the weather might offer. He'd walked because the umbrella in his hands felt like something sacred, something that deserved the full weight of his attention and gratitude. The city sprawled beneath him now, transformed by snow into something that looked almost innocent, as if the white blanket had covered not just the streets and buildings, but also the sharp edges of human ambition and disappointment. David could see the restaurant district from his windows, the warm lights of establishments that stayed open, late for people who needed refuge from the cold or from their own thoughts. Romano's Italian kitchen was too far away to distinguish from the other glowing rectangles, but he knew it was there, and he knew that somewhere in this vast city was a waitress who had given him something more valuable than she could possibly understand. His penthouse occupied the entire top floor of the Columbia Tower, a space designed by architects who understood that wealth should feel weightless, that luxury meant never having to think about the mechanics of comfort. The walls were painted in shades of white that had names like winter breath and morning fog, and the furniture was arranged with the kind of casual precision that cost more than most people earned in a year. Everything in the apartment spoke of success, but nothing spoke of home. David set the umbrella carefully on his kitchen island, a slab of Carrara marble that had been quarried in Italy and shipped across an ocean to serve as a surface where he rarely prepared food. The contrast was striking. The simple black umbrella against the pristine white stone, humble practicality resting atop extravagant luxury. It looked like a question mark punctuating a sentence that had run on too long. He'd built this life deliberately, each decision calculated to create distance between himself and the chaos that had defined his childhood. The penthouse, the expensive suits, the polite barriers he maintained with everyone he encountered, all of it served the same purpose: to ensure that no one could get close enough to disappoint him, and more importantly, that he could never disappoint anyone who mattered. But tonight, a waitress with gentle eyes and snow in her hair had somehow slipped past all his carefully constructed defenses with a single gesture of uncomplicated kindness. She hadn't recognized his name when he'd used his credit card to pay. For dinner, hadn't shown any signs of knowing that he owned not just Romano's, but 17 other restaurants across the Pacific Northwest. She'd simply seen someone who needed help and had offered it freely, without calculation or expectation. David pulled out his phone and scrolled to the contact information for Marcus Webb, the general manager he'd hired to oversee the Romano's chain, so he wouldn't have to spend time in the restaurants himself. He'd bought the original Romano's 3 years ago from an elderly Italian man who'd grown tired of the daily demands of restaurant ownership and had expanded it into a small empire that generated millions in revenue while requiring minimal personal involvement from David himself. He started to type a message asking Marcus about the staff at the downtown location, then stopped. What would he say? That he wanted information about a server who'd been kind to him? That he was interested in learning more about an employee who'd given away her umbrella to a customer? It would sound ridiculous, possibly inappropriate, definitely unlike the detached businessman persona he'd spent years cultivating. David deleted the unsent message and walked to his home office, a space lined with bookshelves that held first editions he'd never read and awards for achievements that felt increasingly hollow. His desk was a monument to organized productivity. 3 monitors arranged in perfect symmetry, wireless keyboards and mice that responded to the lightest touch, filing systems that would have impressed efficiency experts. Everything in its place, everything serving a purpose, everything designed to facilitate the accumulation of more success. But success, David had learned, was a peculiar currency. The more you accumulated, the less it seemed to purchase in terms of actual satisfaction. He could buy anything he wanted, go anywhere he chose, meet anyone he considered worth knowing. Yet here he was at 4 in the morning, standing in a space that cost more per month than most people earned in a year, feeling more alone than he'd felt in a restaurant surrounded by strangers. The umbrella seemed to call to him from the kitchen, and David found himself walking back to stand beside it. He touched the handle gently, remembering the warmth of the waitress's fingers when they'd brushed against his. There had been something electric in that brief contact, something that had nothing to do with static from the dry winter air and everything to do with the shock of genuine human connection. David Romano, though Romano wasn't actually his name, had been born David Chen in a studio apartment above a dry cleaner in southeast Portland. His parents had immigrated from Taiwan when he was 6, carrying dreams wrapped in suitcases and the unshakable belief that America rewarded hard work with prosperity. His father had found employment in a furniture factory, his mother had cleaned office buildings at night, and together they'd saved every penny they could spare to give their son opportunities they'd never had. David had excelled in school because failure wasn't an option, had earned scholarships to prestigious universities because his parents' sacrifices demanded excellence, had graduated with degrees in business and finance because those were fields where immigrant children could build fortunes large enough to justify their parents' faith. He'd changed his name when he started his first company, not out of shame for his heritage, but out of pragmatic recognition that American business often responded better to names that sounded familiar, unthreatening, easily pronounced. The success had come faster than anyone had expected. David possessed an unusual gift for recognizing undervalued assets and transforming them into profitable enterprises. He'd started with small restaurants, places where hard-working owners had great recipes but poor business sense, and had built them into thriving establishments before selling them for substantial profits. The Romano's chain had been his largest acquisition, a sentimental purchase that he'd told himself was about preserving the legacy of authentic Italian cuisine, but was really about proving that a boy from southeast Portland could own the kind. A restaurant his family had never been able to afford to eat in, but somewhere along the way, the accumulation of wealth had become its own prison. David had surrounded himself with people who wanted things from him, employees who needed paychecks, business partners who needed his investment capital, social acquaintances who needed his connections. Everyone in his life had a reason for being there that related to what he could provide rather than who he was underneath the expensive suits and carefully managed public persona. The waitress at Romano's had been different. She'd looked at him and seen a customer who might be cold walking home in the snow, nothing more and nothing less. Her kindness had been offered without agenda, without the expectation of return, without any awareness that he was someone who could change her life with a single phone call. It was the first genuine human interaction he'd experienced in months, possibly years. David opened his laptop and navigated to the employee management system for Romano's restaurants. He had access to personnel files, work schedules, performance, reviews, all the data that reduced human beings to metrics and statistics. It would be easy enough to find information about the server who'd helped him, to learn her name and background and employment history. But something about that felt like a violation of the purity of what had happened between them. Instead, he found himself typing a different kind of search. He pulled up the financial records for Romano's downtown location, scrolling through profit, and lost statements that told the story of a business that was successful but not thriving, profitable but not passionate. The numbers were good enough to satisfy investors, but they revealed nothing about the human stories playing out inside the restaurant, nothing about the dreams and struggles of the people who created those numbers through their daily labor. David had built his fortune by understanding that businesses were fundamentally about people, but somewhere along the way he'd stopped seeing the people and started seeing only the numbers they generated. The waitress who'd given him her umbrella had reminded him that behind every transaction was a human being with hopes and fears and struggles that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or profit margins. He closed the laptop and returned to the kitchen, where the umbrella waited like a small monument to kindness. David picked it up and opened it, creating a canopy of black fabric above his head in the middle of his pristine kitchen. It felt absurd and wonderful at the same time, like a small act of rebellion against the serious, measured way he'd been living his life. The umbrella smelled faintly of her perfume, something subtle and warm that reminded him of vanilla and rain. David closed his eyes and tried to remember every detail of their brief encounter. The way she'd bitten her lower lip while deciding whether to approach him, the genuine concern in her voice when she'd asked if he'd be walking home in the storm, the electric moment when their fingers had touched as she'd pressed the umbrella into his hands. There had been something in her eyes that he recognized, a particular kind of loneliness that came from being surrounded by people, but never truly seen by them. It was the same loneliness he carried, though his was cushioned by wealth and privilege, while hers seemed more raw, more immediate. She was someone who understood what it meant to be invisible, and that understanding had created a bridge between them that had nothing to do with their vastly different circumstances. Gerald's eyes immediately found Maya across the dining room. Despite her tendency toward invisibility, Maya had been working at Romano's longer than any other current server, and her customer service record was spotless. She'd never received a complaint, never been written up for tardiness or attitude, never caused the kind of drama that sometimes erupted when personalities clashed in the high-stress environment of restaurant work. "Chen, come over here," Gerald called, waving her toward the hostess station where Webb was reviewing his notes. Maya approached with the same careful composure she brought to serving difficult customers, her expression pleasant but neutral, her posture suggesting competence without arrogance. Webb looked up from his tablet as she drew near, and for a moment his expression shifted in a way she couldn't quite interpret. Something flickered across his features, surprise, perhaps, or recognition, before settling back into professional neutrality. "You're Maya Chen?" Webb asked, consulting his tablet as if confirming information he already possessed. "Yes, sir," Maya replied, wondering why he seemed to know her name before Gerald had introduced her. "How long have you been working at this location?" 3 years, 2 months, Maya said, automatically providing the same level of detail she'd given to the stranger at table 4 the night before. Webb made a note on his tablet, but Maya noticed that his attention seemed divided, as if he were thinking about something beyond the standard questions of a corporate inspection. There was something familiar about his mannerisms, the way he held his head slightly tilted when he was listening, the precise way he spoke that suggested every word was carefully chosen. "What would you say is the most challenging aspect of working here?" Webb asked, a question that seemed designed to elicit complaints about management or working conditions. Maya considered her answer carefully. She could mention Gerald's tendency to micromanage during stressful periods, or the way the kitchen sometimes fell behind during busy shifts, or the fact that the heating system was inconsistent and left some sections of the dining room uncomfortably cold. But those seemed like minor grievances compared to the larger question of what made work meaningful. "I think the most challenging thing is remembering that every customer has a story," Maya said finally. "It's easy to just see orders and table, numbers, but every person who comes through that door is dealing with something, celebrating something good, or trying to forget something difficult. The challenge is making sure they feel seen and cared for, even when you're busy and tired and dealing with your own problems. Webb looked up from his tablet, and Maya saw something shift in his expression again, a softening around his eyes that seemed inconsistent with his corporate inspector persona. He studied her face with an intensity that made her slightly uncomfortable, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle she wasn't aware she'd presented. "That's an interesting perspective," Webb said slowly. "Do you feel like the current management structure supports that approach to customer service?" It was a loaded question, the kind that could get Gerald in trouble if she answered honestly. Maya chose her words carefully, trying to navigate between truth and diplomacy. "I think everyone here wants to do good work," she said. "Sometimes the pressure to meet certain metrics can make it harder to focus on the individual human connections. But that's probably true in any business." Webb nodded, making another note on his tablet. "If you could change one thing about how this restaurant operates, what would it be?" Maya hesitated. The question felt like a trap, but there was something in Webb's expression that suggested he genuinely wanted to hear her answer. She thought about the resignation letter sitting on her table at home, about all the dreams she'd been too afraid to voice, about the possibility that someone in a position of authority might actually care about the perspective of a server who'd spent 3 years observing the intersection of business and humanity. "I think we could do more to create a sense of community," Maya said, choosing her words carefully. "Not just for customers, but for staff too. When people feel like they're part of something meaningful, they bring more of themselves to their work. And when employees are genuinely invested in what they're doing, customers can feel that energy." Webb was quiet for a long moment, his fingers poised over his tablet as if he were deciding what to record. When he looked up at Maya again, there was something different in his expression, something that looked almost like recognition, mixed with surprise. "Thank you, Ms. Chen," he said formally. "That will be all for now." Maya nodded and returned to her section, but she could feel Webb's attention following her as she moved through the dining room. There was something about the interaction that felt significant beyond the usual stress of a corporate inspection, something that made her think this particular inspector might be different from the others she'd encountered. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of nervous energy as Webb continued his evaluation, speaking with kitchen staff and reviewing financial records and observing the flow of service during the dinner preparation period. Maya tried to focus on her work, but she found herself stealing glances at the corporate inspector, noting the way he seemed to be paying attention to details that had nothing to do with efficiency or profit margins. As her shift neared its end, Maya realized that Webb reminded her of someone, though she couldn't quite place who. There was something about his mannerisms, the careful way he observed everything around him, that felt familiar in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't until she was wiping down table 4, the same table where the stranger had sat the night before, that the connection suddenly became clear. Webb moved through the dining room with the same quiet attention she'd noticed in the customer, who'd accepted her umbrella, the same way of watching without seeming to watch, of being present without demanding attention. The realization hit her so suddenly that she nearly dropped the rag she was holding. Could it be possible that the corporate inspector and the lonely customer were the same person? But that would mean... Maya's thoughts were interrupted by Webb. Approaching her station, his tablet tucked under his arm, and his expression unreadable. "Ms. Chen," he said quietly, "I wonder if I could speak with you privately before I leave." Maya followed Webb toward the small office behind the kitchen that Gerald used for paperwork and inventory management. Her heart was beating faster than it should have been for a simple employee evaluation, but something about Webb's demeanor suggested this conversation would be different from the standard corporate inspection interview. The way he'd looked at her when she mentioned creating community, The familiar tilt of his head when he listened, these details were adding up to a conclusion that seemed impossible but increasingly unavoidable. The office was cramped and cluttered, filled with filing cabinets and boxes of supplies that hadn't yet been organized. Webb closed the door behind them and gestured for Maya to take the single chair across from Gerald's desk, while he remained standing, his expensive suit looking out of place in the modest workspace. "I want to thank you for your honesty during our conversation," Webb began, his voice softer than it had been during the formal inspection. "Your perspective on customer service is refreshing, especially in an industry that often prioritizes efficiency over genuine human connection." Maya nodded politely, but she was studying his face, looking for confirmation of the suspicion that had been building throughout the afternoon. In the fluorescent lighting of the small office, she could see him more clearly than she had in the dining room, and the resemblance to the customer from the night before was becoming undeniable. The same brown eyes, the same careful way of choosing words, the same quality of attention that made her feel truly seen. "Ms. Chen," Webb continued, and something in his tone had shifted, becoming more personal, less corporate. "I have a confession to make. Last night, I had dinner at this restaurant, table 4, and you gave me something that I haven't been able to stop thinking about." Maya felt the breath catch in her chest. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, but the picture they created was so unexpected that she struggled to process what it meant. Webb was the customer who'd needed her umbrella, but Webb was also the corporate inspector, which meant he was someone with the power to change her life in ways she'd never imagined. "You're him," she said quietly, the words coming out before she could stop them. "The customer from last night." Webb nodded, and for the first time since he'd arrived at the restaurant, his corporate mask slipped completely. The guarded expression softened, replaced by something vulnerable and genuine that reminded Maya of exactly why she'd felt compelled to offer her umbrella to a stranger in the snow. "My name isn't actually Webb," he said, sitting on the edge of Gerald's desk so they were at eye level. "It's David Romano, and I'm not just a corporate inspector, I'm the owner of this restaurant chain." Maya stared at him, trying to reconcile the lonely customer who'd eaten dinner alone with the successful businessman who apparently owned not just Romano's, but multiple establishments. The contrast was jarring, like discovering that someone you'd thought was a fellow traveler was actually the person who owned the entire highway. "You own Romano's," Maya repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I bought the original restaurant 3 years ago," David explained. "Expanded it into a small chain. But I've never actually worked in one of the locations, never spent time observing how they operate from the perspective of someone who isn't the owner. Last night was the first time I'd eaten at one of my own restaurants as just another customer." Maya felt a strange combination of emotions washing over her. Embarrassment at having revealed so much personal information to someone who could fire her with a phone call, confusion about why the owner of a successful restaurant chain would eat alone at one of his own establishments, and something that might have been betrayal at learning that their moment of connection had been built on incomplete information. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, though even as she said it, she realized how ridiculous the question was. Why would a restaurant owner reveal his identity to a server he'd just met? "Because what happened between us last night was the most genuine human interaction I've had in years," David said, his voice carrying the weight of someone admitting something he'd never said aloud. "You didn't see me as David Romano, successful businessman. You saw someone who looked cold and lonely and might need help getting home safely. Do you have any idea how rare that is?" Maya thought about the loneliness she'd recognized in his eyes. The night before, the way he'd eaten his meal with such careful attention, as if he were trying to remember how to find pleasure in simple things. She was beginning to understand that wealth and success hadn't protected him from the kind of isolation she knew intimately. The peculiar sadness of being surrounded by people who saw you only in terms of what you could provide for them. "I don't understand," Maya said. "You could eat anywhere, go anywhere. Why would you choose to spend your evening alone in one of your own restaurants?" David was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on his hands. When he looked up at Maya again, there was something raw in his expression, a vulnerability that seemed to cost him considerable effort to reveal. "Because I've built a life where everyone wants something from me," he said. "Business partners want my investment capital. Employees want job security. Social acquaintances want access to my connections. Even my family relationships are complicated by the fact that I have money and resources that people need. Last night, I wanted to be somewhere where I could just exist without anyone expecting anything from me." Maya understood that feeling more than she could easily explain. The invisibility she'd cultivated as a server was her own form of protection, a way of moving through the world without having to navigate the complex expectations that came with being truly seen. But David's invisibility was different. He was hiding not from attention, but from the wrong kind of attention, from people who saw his wealth before they saw his humanity. "The umbrella," Maya said slowly, pieces of the puzzle continuing to fall into place. "You still have it." David smiled, and for a moment he looked exactly like the lonely customer who'd thanked her with such genuine gratitude. "It's sitting on my kitchen counter right now. I've been carrying it with me today, actually, like a talisman." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out Maya's black umbrella, setting it gently on Gerald's desk between them. Seeing it again brought back the memory of that moment on the snowy sidewalk, the electric connection she'd felt when their fingers touched, the warmth that had spread through her chest when she'd realized she was giving something freely without calculating the cost. "I need to ask you something," David said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "And I want you to know that your answer won't affect your employment here in any way. But I have to know, when you gave me this umbrella, was it because you felt sorry for me? Because you thought I looked like someone who needed help?" Maya considered the question carefully. She could give him the answer that would be kind and diplomatic, the response that would smooth over any awkwardness and allow them both to pretend this conversation was less significant than it felt. But something about David's honesty demanded the same level of truth in return. "No," she said finally. "I gave it to you because I recognized something in you that I see in myself. You looked like someone who was used to being alone, someone who'd learned how to be invisible, and I thought maybe, just for one night, you didn't have to be." David's eyes closed briefly, as if her words had hit something tender and unexpected. When he opened them again, there were tears threatening at the corners, quickly blinked away, but not before Maya noticed them. "For 3 years, I've been trying to build businesses that matter," David said. "Restaurants where people can gather and connect and feel like they're part of something larger than themselves. But I've been doing it from a distance, managing through reports and financial statements and other people's observations. I never understood what I was actually trying to create until last night, when you showed me what it looks like when someone chooses kindness without expecting anything in return." Maya felt something shifting in her chest, a recognition that this conversation was moving toward territory she'd never explored before. The resignation letter sitting on her table at home seemed to belong to a different version of herself, someone who'd believed her only options were to disappear or to continue being invisible. But sitting across from David Romano, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes and hearing the genuine gratitude in his voice, Maya was beginning to imagine possibilities she'd never allowed herself to consider. "What happens now?" Maya asked, the question encompassing more than just their immediate situation. "That depends," David said. During our conversation earlier, you mentioned wanting to create a sense of community. You talked about making sure people feel seen and cared for. Those aren't just nice ideas, they're the foundation of what great restaurants actually do. They create spaces where people can connect with each other and with something larger than their individual lives. Maya nodded, remembering the anniversary couple at table 12, the way they'd wanted to share their story with someone who would listen and care. She thought about Mrs. Patterson and her Tuesday early bird specials, about the first dates at table 18, and the regular customers whose orders she'd memorized, not because it was efficient, but because remembering details was a form of love. "I have a proposition for you," David continued, "not just for you, but for this restaurant. I want to implement some changes here, try some new approaches that prioritize the kind of community building you described, but I can't do it from my office downtown. I need someone who understands what it means to see customers as whole human beings rather than just revenue streams." Maya felt her heart beginning to race. "What kind of changes?" "Staff development programs that focus on connection, rather than just efficiency. Menu changes that reflect what the community actually wants, rather than what corporate thinks will be most profitable. Spaces for customers to gather and interact, rather than just eat and leave. Training that helps everyone who works here understand that they're not just serving food, they're creating experiences that can brighten someone's entire day." David leaned forward, his expression intense but hopeful. "I want you to help me redesign how this restaurant operates. Not as a server, but as someone who understands both the business side and the human side of what we do. Someone who can help bridge the gap between profit and purpose." Maya stared at him, trying to process what he was offering. It sounded like the kind of opportunity she dreamed about, but had never believed was possible for someone like her. Someone without business training or corporate experience. Someone who'd spent 3 years learning to be invisible. "I don't have a degree in business management," Maya said. "I don't know anything about corporate operations or profit margins or any of the things you'd need for something like this." "You know something more valuable than any of that," David replied. "You know how to see people. You understand what it means to create genuine connections. Those are skills that can't be taught in business school. They have to be learned through experience, through paying attention, through caring enough to notice what other people need." Maya thought about the notebooks filled with observations she'd been keeping for years, the stories she'd collected about the people who passed through Romano's dining room. She thought about her dream of opening a small cafe where everyone felt welcome and seen, where invisibility was impossible because everyone who entered was noticed and valued. "There's something you should know," Maya said, reaching into her apron pocket and pulling out the folded resignation letter. "I was planning to quit. I wrote this weeks ago, but never had the courage to submit it." David took the letter and read it quickly, his expression growing more serious with each line. When he finished, he folded it carefully and handed it back to her. "What changed your mind?" he asked. "Last night," Maya said simply. "Giving you the umbrella reminded me that I don't have to be invisible. That maybe there's a difference between being overlooked and choosing to remain hidden. Maybe I've been hiding not because the world doesn't see me, but because I've been afraid of what might happen if it did." David smiled, and Maya saw in his expression the same mixture of hope and vulnerability she felt in her own chest. They were both people who'd learned to protect themselves through isolation, but last night had shown them both that connection was possible, that kindness could be its own form of courage. "So what do you say?" David asked. "Are you willing to help me figure out how to build something that matters?" Maya looked at the resignation letter in her hands, then at the umbrella sitting on the desk between them, then at David's face, which was filled with the kind of hopeful uncertainty she recognized because it matched her own. For the first time in years, she felt like she was standing at the edge of something that could change not just her circumstances, but her entire understanding of what was possible. "Yes," she said, the word coming out strong and clear without hesitation. "Yes, I'll help you." 6 weeks later, Maya stood in the center of Romano's dining room at 7 in the morning, watching the transformation she'd helped design take shape around her. The restaurant looked fundamentally the same. Same red-checkered tablecloths, same warm Edison bulb lighting, same view of the street through large windows, but everything felt different in ways that were both subtle and profound. The changes had started small. David had insisted on that, understanding that revolutionary shifts in restaurant culture happened through accumulated details rather than dramatic overhauls. They'd begun by rearranging the furniture to create more intimate conversation spaces, moving tables closer together in some areas, while creating cozy nooks in others where people could have private conversations or work quietly on laptops without feeling isolated from the energy of the room. Maya had suggested adding a community bulletin board near the entrance, where customers could leave notes for each other, advertise services, or simply share thoughts that might brighten someone else's day. The board had filled up within a week, with everything from offers to walk elderly neighbors' dogs, to invitations for coffee dates, to thank-you notes addressed to servers who'd made difficult days a little brighter. But the most significant changes had been in the staff training program that Maya and David had developed together. Instead of focusing solely on efficiency and order accuracy, they'd created workshops that taught servers how to read the emotional temperature of their tables, how to recognize when someone needed to be left alone versus when they were hoping for friendly conversation, how to make genuine connections without overstepping professional boundaries. Maya had been amazed to discover that she possessed natural teaching abilities she'd never recognized. Standing in front of a group of servers, sharing techniques for creating meaningful interactions with customers, she'd felt a confidence she'd never experienced before. Her years of invisible observation had given her insights that proved invaluable when translated into practical training strategies. The key, she'd explained during a recent training session, is remembering that everyone who walks through that door is carrying something we can't see. Maybe they're celebrating a promotion or mourning a loss or working up the courage to have a difficult conversation. Our job isn't to fix their problems, but to create a space where they feel safe and welcome while they figure things out for themselves. David had implemented these programs across all 17 Romano's locations, but he'd chosen the downtown restaurant as the pilot site where new ideas could be tested and refined before being rolled out system-wide. Maya found herself spending most of her time there now, no longer working as a server, but as what David had titled Director of Community Engagement, a position he'd created specifically for her unique combination of interpersonal skills and operational understanding. The role felt surreal sometimes, especially when Maya remembered the resignation letter she'd never submitted, still tucked away in her notebook at home, like a reminder of how dramatically circumstances could change when you chose courage over safety. She was earning more money than she'd ever imagined possible, but more importantly, she was doing work that felt meaningful in ways that went beyond financial compensation. This morning, Maya was preparing for the arrival of a food critic from Portland Monthly magazine who'd heard rumors about the changes at Romano's and wanted to experience them firsthand. The review could significantly impact the restaurant's reputation and, by extension, the success of the community-focused approach Maya and David had been developing. Maya walked through the dining room, checking details that had become second nature over the past 6 weeks. The fresh flowers on each table, a suggestion from Mrs. Patterson, who'd noticed that small touches of beauty made meals feel more special. The handwritten daily specials board that featured not just ingredients, but stories about where they'd been sourced, connecting customers to the local farmers and producers who made their meals possible. The subtle background music playlist that Maya had carefully curated to create atmosphere without overwhelming conversation. At table 4, where this entire journey had begun on a snowy evening that felt simultaneously like yesterday and a lifetime ago, Maya paused to adjust the placement of the salt and pepper shakers. David had wanted to designate the table as somehow special, maybe with a small plaque commemorating the moment that had changed both their lives. But Maya had argued for keeping it exactly the same as every other table. The magic hadn't been in the furniture or the location, but in the willingness of two lonely people to see each other clearly and choose kindness despite their fears. The front door chimed, and Maya looked up to see David entering the restaurant earlier than usual. Over the past 6 weeks, he'd been spending increasing amounts of time at the downtown location, not just overseeing the implementation of their new programs, but genuinely enjoying the day-to-day rhythm of restaurant operations. Maya had watched him discover aspects of his own business that he'd never experienced from his corporate office, and she'd seen him bloom in ways that reminded her of her own transformation. "Morning," David said, hanging his coat on the rack by the door. He'd stopped wearing expensive suits to the restaurant, opting instead for casual clothes that allowed him to move easily between the dining room and kitchen, to sit with customers who wanted to share feedback, to work alongside servers during busy periods when extra hands were needed. "Are you nervous about the review?" Maya asked, noting the slight tension in his shoulders that appeared whenever external validation was at stake. "Terrified," David admitted with a self-deprecating smile, "but also excited. 6 weeks ago, I would have been nervous about profit margins and efficiency ratings. Today, I'm nervous about whether we're actually creating the kind of experience that makes people feel like they matter." Maya understood the distinction. The metrics that had once defined success at Romano's, table turnover rates, average check amounts, labor cost percentages, were still important for the financial health of the business. But they'd become secondary to less quantifiable measures. The number of customers who lingered over their meals because they didn't want to leave. The frequency with which strangers struck up conversations at neighboring tables. The thank you notes that arrived in the mail from people who'd experienced something at Romano's that had brightened difficult periods in their lives. "I've been thinking about something," Maya said, settling into the chair across from David at table 4. "About what happens if this doesn't work, if the critic hates what we've done, if corporate decides the community focus is too expensive, if customers don't respond the way we hope they will." David looked at her with the same quality of attention he'd shown on that first night, the complete presence that had made her feel seen rather than invisible. "What conclusion did you reach?" "That it's already working," Maya said. "Maybe not, in ways that will show up in a magazine review, but in ways that matter to the people who work here and the customers who choose to spend their time here. Sarah told me yesterday that she looks forward to coming to work now because she feels like she's part of something meaningful." Mrs. Patterson brought her granddaughter for lunch last week and spent an hour showing her off to everyone in the dining room. The anniversary couple from table 12 has started bringing their friends here for special occasions because they say the atmosphere reminds them of how restaurants used to feel when they were young. David nodded slowly, and Maya could see something relaxing in his expression. "You're right. We've already succeeded at the thing that matters most. Everything else is just documentation." The morning preparation continued with the familiar rhythm Maya had come to love. Servers arriving and checking their sections, kitchen staff beginning prep work for the lunch service, the gradual transformation of an empty restaurant into a space ready to welcome whatever stories people would bring through the door. Maya found herself moving through the tasks with a sense of ownership and pride she'd never experienced before, not just in the work itself, but in the vision she'd helped create and implement. At 10:30, Gerald arrived for his shift, and Maya was struck by how much he'd changed over the past 6 weeks. The perpetual worry lines around his eyes had softened, and he moved through the restaurant with a confidence that came from knowing his job was no longer just about enforcing corporate policies, but about helping create experiences that mattered to people. David had promoted him to general manager and given him significant autonomy to implement the community-focused initiatives, recognizing that sustainable change required buy-in from everyone in the organization. The critic should be here around noon, Gerald told Maya and David during their brief morning meeting. I've briefed the entire staff, but I want them to treat her exactly like any other customer. No special treatment, no putting on a show. Just the genuine experience we've been working to create for everyone. Maya appreciated Gerald's approach. The temptation with restaurant critics was always to provide exceptional service that didn't reflect the typical customer experience, but their entire philosophy was built on the idea that everyone who entered Romano's deserved to feel special and welcomed. Treating the critic differently would undermine the authenticity of what they'd built. As the lunch service began, Maya positioned herself where she could observe the dining room while remaining unobtrusive. She'd developed this skill over years of serving, but now she used it for different purposes, watching for opportunities to enhance customer experiences, identifying moments when servers might need support, recognizing the subtle dynamics that made some meals memorable while others remained merely functional. The critic arrived precisely at noon, identifiable not because she announced herself, but because of the way she observed everything with the practiced eye of someone whose job was professional evaluation. Maya watched her take note of the community bulletin board, the carefully curated music, the way servers interacted with customers at neighboring tables. She ordered the house special and sat at table 18, the same spot where Maya had observed countless first dates and family celebrations. Throughout the meal, Maya noticed the critic paying attention to details that had nothing to do with food quality, the way their server, Marcus, remembered her preference for still rather than sparkling water without being asked twice. The moment when the elderly gentleman at table 9 dropped his napkin and 3 different staff members moved to help him retrieve it. The spontaneous conversation that developed between the critic and the young mother at the adjacent table, whose toddler was fascinated by the flowers on each table. After the critic finished her meal and left, Maya felt a sense of calm satisfaction rather than the anxiety she'd expected. They'd shown her exactly what Romano's had become. Not a perfect restaurant, but an authentic one. A place where imperfections were smoothed over by genuine care and attention to the human elements that made dining experiences memorable. How do you think it went? David asked, joining Maya at the hostess station where she'd been observing the lunch service. I think she saw what we wanted her to see, Maya replied. Not a performance, but the real thing. Whether she responds positively to that is out of our control. David smiled, and Maya recognized the expression as one of genuine pride, mixed with relief. 6 weeks ago, I would have spent the rest of the day obsessing over every detail of that interaction, trying to predict the outcome and control variables that were never actually within my control. Today, I feel proud of what we've built here, regardless of how one person chooses to write about it. Maya understood the shift he was describing, because she'd experienced something similar. The old version of herself would have spent hours analyzing every moment of the critic's visit, wondering if she'd made mistakes or missed opportunities to create a better impression. But the work she'd been doing at Romano's had taught her that authenticity mattered more than perfection, that genuine connections were more valuable than flawless execution. As the afternoon wore on and the lunch rush transitioned into the quieter period before dinner service, Maya found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 weeks ago, she'd been an invisible server, planning to quit her job because she felt like she was disappearing more each day. Today, she was helping to run a restaurant that had become a model for community-focused hospitality, working alongside someone who'd transformed from a lonely customer into a collaborative partner in creating something meaningful. The changes in her own life had been as dramatic as the changes in the restaurant. She'd moved from her studio apartment to a larger, one-bedroom place closer to downtown. She'd enrolled in the business management courses she'd been avoiding for months, not because David required it, but because she wanted to develop skills that would make her more effective in her new role. Most importantly, she'd learned that being seen didn't have to be frightening, that visibility could be empowering when it was built on authentic connection rather than performance. "Maya," David said, interrupting her thoughts, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to feel completely free to say no." Maya looked at him with curiosity, noting the slightly nervous energy that suggested he was about to propose something significant. "I've been thinking about expanding this model to other locations," David continued. "Not just implementing the training programs we've developed, but actually transforming the entire approach to how Romano's operates. It would mean traveling to different restaurants, working with managers and staff to implement community-focused initiatives, essentially becoming the architect of a new way of thinking about hospitality." Maya felt her heart begin to race as she processed what David was suggesting. It would mean leaving the comfortable familiarity of the downtown location, taking on responsibilities she'd never imagined having, stepping into a level of visibility and authority that would have terrified her just weeks ago. "It would be a significant promotion," David added. "Vice President of Community Development, you'd be helping to reshape not just Romano's, but potentially the entire industry's approach to customer relationships. But it would also mean giving up the hands-on daily interactions you have here, trading direct customer contact for strategic planning and organizational development." Maya looked around the dining room, at the servers she'd trained and the customers whose stories she'd been following, and the space that had become her laboratory for testing ideas about human connection. The thought of leaving felt like grief, but the opportunity David was describing felt like the natural evolution of everything she'd been learning and building. "Can I think about it?" Maya asked. "Of course," David said. "Take all the time you need. But Maya, I want you to know that whatever you decide, what you've accomplished here has already changed everything. You've shown me that business success and human values don't have to be mutually exclusive. You've proven that authenticity can be profitable and that kindness can be a competitive advantage. That's a gift I'll carry with me regardless of what happens next." Maya nodded, feeling the weight and possibility of the choice ahead of her, knowing that whatever she decided would be based not on fear, but on a clear-eyed assessment of where she could make the greatest impact, where her particular combination of skills and insights could create the most meaningful change. Maya walked home that evening with David's offer weighing on her mind like a question that demanded an answer she wasn't ready to give. The city around her hummed with the energy of early spring, the harsh winter that had brought her and David together now giving way to longer days and the promise of warmth returning to the world. She took a different route than usual, needing the extra time to think, to process the magnitude of what David was proposing and what it would mean for the life she'd been building. The streets were busy with people emerging from the hibernation that Portland winters imposed. Sidewalk cafes reopening their patios, joggers returning to the riverside paths, couples walking hand in hand without the barrier of heavy coats and scarves. Maya found herself observing these small signs of renewal with the same attention she'd once devoted to studying customers at Romano's, noting the way people moved differently when they believed better weather was coming. Her new apartment was in the Pearl District, a neighborhood she'd never imagined being able to afford, but which David's promotion had made possible. The building was converted warehouse space similar to her old studio, but everything about it felt different. Bigger windows that let in more light, higher ceilings that made breathing feel easier, neighbors who smiled in the hallways instead of avoiding eye contact. Maya climbed the stairs to the third floor, her footsteps echoing in the stairwell with a satisfying solidity that reminded her how much her circumstances had changed in just 6 weeks. She unlocked her door and stepped into a space that still felt new enough to surprise her. Hardwood floors that gleamed under track lighting, a kitchen with actual counter space, and appliances that worked reliably. A living area large enough for both a couch and a desk, where she could work on the training materials she'd been developing. But the most significant change was the wall she'd designated for what she called her story collection. Dozens of index cards pinned to a large corkboard, each one containing an observation about customers she'd served over the years. She'd started the project as a way of honoring the human connections that had made her work meaningful, but it had evolved into something more like a map of human nature, a visual representation of all the small dramas and quiet victories she'd witnessed during her time at Romano's. Maya made herself tea and settled on the couch, pulling out the notebook where she'd been keeping track of her thoughts about David's offer. The promotion he was proposing would be everything she'd never allowed herself to dream about: real authority, substantial income, the opportunity to influence how an entire company approached the intersection of business and humanity. But it would also mean leaving behind the hands-on work that had taught her everything she knew about creating genuine connections. She opened her notebook and began writing, not trying to reach a conclusion, but simply exploring the complexity of the choice ahead of her. "What I would gain," she wrote at the top of a fresh page, then listed everything that made David's offer attractive: the chance to implement community-focused changes across all 17 Romano's locations, the ability to develop training programs that could transform how servers throughout the company approach their work, the satisfaction of knowing that her ideas about kindness and authenticity could reach thousands of customers, instead of just the few dozen she encountered each day. On the facing page, she wrote what I would lose and found the list flowing just as easily. The daily interactions with regular customers whose stories she'd been following for years, the immediate feedback that came from seeing how small changes in approach could brighten someone's entire day, the hands-on problem-solving that came with managing real situations in real time rather than developing theoretical frameworks. Maya set down her pen and looked at the story collection on her wall, each index card representing a moment when she'd connected with another person in a way that mattered. Mrs. Patterson and her Tuesday early bird specials, the anniversary couple who'd shared their photo album, the shy teenager who'd gained confidence through their weekly conversations about books, the businessman who'd started leaving bigger tips after Maya had noticed he was going through a difficult divorce and had made sure he never had to eat alone unless he wanted to. These weren't just pleasant memories. They were evidence of the kind of impact that was possible when you paid attention to people as individuals rather than as customers or revenue streams. The question David's offer posed was whether she could create more meaningful change by scaling up her approach to reach more people, or whether the essence of what she did would be lost in translation from personal interaction to corporate policy. Maya's phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah, one of the servers she'd been training. "Just wanted to thank you again for the workshop on reading table dynamics. I had an elderly gentleman tonight who seemed upset about something, and I used the techniques you taught us to figure out he was worried about his wife, who's in the hospital. Turned out he just needed someone to listen for a few minutes. He left the biggest tip I've ever received, but more importantly, he said I made him feel less alone. That's the kind of impact you taught me was possible." Reading Sarah's message, Maya felt a surge of pride mixed with clarity. This was exactly the kind of ripple effect she'd been hoping to create through the training programs. servers who understood that their work was about more than delivering food, who recognized that they had the power to make difficult days a little brighter for the people they served. But Sarah's success had happened because of direct, hands-on training that allowed Maya to share not just techniques, but the underlying philosophy that made those techniques effective. Maya walked to her kitchen and made another cup of tea, then stood at her window looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, David was probably in his penthouse, grappling with his own questions about growth and change, about how to maintain the authentic connections that had transformed his understanding of success, while expanding their reach to benefit more people. She thought about the umbrella, still sitting on David's kitchen counter according to what he'd told her, serving as a daily reminder of the moment when a simple act of kindness had changed both their lives. The umbrella itself hadn't been special. It was a cheap, functional object she'd bought without thinking much about it. But the gesture of giving it away had created something neither of them could have predicted, a partnership built on shared recognition of what mattered most in human interactions. Maya returned to her notebook and started writing again. But this time, she wasn't making lists of pros and cons. Instead, she found herself articulating the principles that had guided her work at Romano's, the underlying beliefs that had made her training programs effective and her customer interactions meaningful. "People want to be seen," she wrote, "not just acknowledged or served efficiently, but actually seen as individuals with their own stories and struggles and hopes. When someone feels truly seen, they respond with a warmth and openness that transforms routine interactions into genuine connections." "Kindness is contagious," she continued. "When servers approach their work with genuine care for customer well-being, customers respond by being kinder to servers, to each other, and to the people they encounter after they leave the restaurant. A single moment of authentic connection can improve someone's entire day, which they then carry into their other relationships." "Authenticity can't be faked," Maya wrote on the next line. "Training programs that focus on techniques without addressing underlying attitudes will produce performances rather than genuine care. The most effective way to teach authentic customer service is to model it, to create environments where staff feel seen and valued so they naturally extend that same attention to customers." As she wrote, Maya began to see a path forward that hadn't been visible when she was thinking about David's offer in binary terms: accept or decline, corporate advancement or hands-on work, scaling up or staying small. What if there was a way to do both? What if the vice president position could be structured to maintain the hands-on elements that made her work effective while also expanding its reach? Maya looked at her phone and realized it was nearly 11 o'clock. Too late to call David, but not too late to send a text that might help him understand where her thinking was headed. "I've been reflecting on your offer," she typed. "I'm interested, but I want to discuss whether there might be ways to structure the role that would allow me to maintain direct customer and staff contact while also working on systemic change. Could we talk tomorrow about what a hybrid approach might look like?" She sent the message and immediately felt a sense of relief, as if articulating the possibility of a middle path had released some of the pressure she'd been feeling to make an either-or choice. Maya prepared for bed but found herself too energized to sleep immediately. Instead, she sat at her desk and began sketching out ideas for how a VP role could incorporate the hands-on elements that made her work effective. What if each Romano's location served as a laboratory for testing new community-focused initiatives? What if her position required her to spend significant time at different restaurants, working directly with staff and customers to understand what approaches worked best in different communities? She envisioned a role that would allow her to implement changes gradually and organically, testing ideas on a small scale before rolling them out system-wide. maintaining the authenticity that came from real relationships while also creating frameworks that could benefit thousands of people. It would be more complex than either a purely corporate position or a purely hands-on role, but complexity might be exactly what was needed to address the challenge of scaling authentic human connection. Maya's phone buzzed with David's response. "I love that you're thinking creatively about this. Let's have lunch tomorrow and explore what a hybrid model could look like. I've been wondering the same thing. How to grow without losing the essence of what makes this work. Maybe the answer isn't choosing between approaches, but finding ways to integrate them." Reading his message, Maya felt a familiar warmth, the same feeling she'd experienced on that snowy night when she'd recognized someone who understood the particular challenges of trying to remain authentic in a world that often rewarded performance over genuine connection. David wasn't just offering her a promotion. He was inviting her to help solve one of the fundamental problems of modern business: how to maintain human values while achieving the scale necessary to make meaningful impact. Maya set her phone aside and returned to her notebook, but now she was writing with a different energy, sketching out possibilities rather than weighing pros and cons. She imagined visiting Romano's locations across the region, working with managers and servers to understand the unique dynamics of their communities, developing training programs that could be adapted to different contexts while maintaining core principles of authentic care. She pictured herself splitting time between corporate strategy sessions and dining room shifts, between developing policy frameworks and having one-on-one conversations with servers who were struggling to connect with difficult customers. It would be demanding work, requiring her to operate effectively in both boardrooms and restaurant floors, but it would also allow her to bridge the gap between high-level business planning and real-world human interaction. As Maya finally prepared for bed, she felt more excited about the future than she had since that night when she'd given away her umbrella. The path forward wasn't the one David had initially proposed, but it might be something better, an approach that honored both the need for systemic change and the importance of individual connections, both the vision of reaching more people and the commitment to maintaining authenticity in how they were reached. She fell asleep thinking about all the servers she could train, all the customers who might experience something at Romano's that would make their days a little brighter, all the ways that choosing kindness over efficiency might create ripple effects that extended far beyond the walls of any single restaurant. And in her dreams, there were umbrellas everywhere. Not just her small black one, but hundreds of them, each one representing a moment when someone had chosen to give freely without calculating the cost, creating connections that transformed ordinary interactions into something meaningful and lasting. The next morning, Maya woke with a clarity that felt like sunshine after a long period of clouds. She knew what she wanted to propose to David, and more importantly, she knew why it mattered. The conversation ahead wasn't just about her career path. It was about creating a model for how businesses could prioritize human connection while still achieving the growth necessary to make real impact in the world. As they left Romano's together, Maya caught sight of her reflection in the front window and realized she was smiling the same smile she'd worn on that snowy night when she'd given away her umbrella. It was the smile of someone who discovered that the best things in life happened when you stopped calculating costs and started giving freely, when you chose connection over protection, when you remembered that kindness was always possible, even in the most ordinary moments. The story that had begun with a simple act of compassion between strangers was becoming something neither of them could have predicted. A blueprint for transforming not just restaurants, but entire communities, one genuine interaction at a time. And Maya knew that somewhere in cities she hadn't yet visited, there were servers waiting to learn that their work mattered, customers hoping to feel less alone, and countless small moments where choosing kindness over efficiency could change everything. The umbrella had been returned to its giver in the form of opportunity, and the gift was multiplying in ways that would ripple outward for years to come, touching lives that Maya and David would never know about, but would always be connected to through the simple decision to believe that human connection was worth any risk. If this story of transformation through unexpected kindness has touched your heart, remember that every day offers chances to be someone's umbrella, to offer shelter, comfort, or simply the recognition that they matter. Sometimes the smallest gestures create the largest changes, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is see someone clearly and choose compassion. Thank you for staying with Maya and David's journey to the end, where quiet truths often echo the loudest. If their story reminded you that authenticity and kindness can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can keep sharing stories that heal and inspire, one genuine connection at a time. Maya arrived at Romano's the next day to find David already waiting at table 4. 2 cups of coffee growing cold between them as he stared out the window with the same contemplative expression she'd noticed on that first snowy evening. The morning light streaming through the glass made the dining room look different than it did during service hours. Emptier, but somehow more intimate, like a theatre stage waiting for the day's performance to begin. "I've been thinking about your text all night," David said as Maya sat down across from him. "And I realized I've been approaching this wrong. I was so focused on creating a traditional corporate structure that I forgot the most important lesson you taught me, that the best solutions usually come from actually listening to people rather than imposing predetermined frameworks." Maya smiled, noting how much David had changed since that first night when he'd eaten his meal with such careful solitude. The man sitting across from her now spoke with the confidence of someone who'd learned to trust collaboration over control, who understood that the best business decisions often emerged from genuine conversations rather than strategic planning sessions. "I have an idea," Maya said, pulling out the notebook where she'd been sketching possibilities. "What if we created something that's never existed before? Not just a vice president position, but a completely new approach to how restaurant chains think about community engagement." David leaned forward, his attention focused entirely on Maya's words. "Tell me more." "What if my role was to spend 3 months at each Romano's location, working directly with staff and customers to understand what that specific community needs?" Maya explained, her excitement building as she articulated the vision that had crystallized overnight. "I'd live in each city, eat at the restaurant regularly, train the servers, develop relationships with regular customers, and figure out how to make that particular location feel like the heart of its neighborhood." David's eyes widened as he processed the implications. You'd essentially become a traveling community architect, not imposing a one-size-fits-all model, but helping each location discover its own authentic identity. "Exactly," Maya said. "And then, after 3 months, I'd document what worked, what didn't, what adaptations were necessary for that specific community. Over time, we'd build a library of approaches that other restaurant companies could learn from. We wouldn't just be transforming Romano's, we'd be creating a blueprint for how the entire industry could prioritize human connection." David was quiet for a long moment, and Maya could see him imagining the possibilities. When he looked up, there was something in his expression that reminded her of her own excitement when she'd first realized that her notebooks full of customer observations might have value beyond personal reflection. "It would take years," David said slowly. 17 locations, 3 months each. You'd be constantly traveling, constantly adapting to new communities, constantly having to prove that authentic connection can be more valuable than traditional efficiency metrics. "I know," Maya replied, and there's no guarantee it would work. Some locations might resist change. Some communities might not respond to our approach. Some corporate executives might decide the whole experiment is too expensive or too risky. But if it did work, David continued, his voice gaining energy, if we could prove that prioritizing human connection actually improves business outcomes across diverse markets and demographics, it could change everything, not just for Romanos, but for how businesses think about their relationship with the communities they serve. Maya nodded, feeling the same sense of possibility that had kept her awake the night before. There's something else I want to document. The entire process, not just the business metrics, but the human stories. I want to write about the servers who discover they can make a difference in people's lives, the customers who find community in unexpected places, the ways that small acts of kindness create ripple effects that extend far beyond restaurant walls. David's expression shifted, becoming more personal, more vulnerable. You want to write about it. I think there are people everywhere who feel invisible, who've learned to protect themselves by not expecting too much from human interactions, Maya said. If we can prove that authentic connection is possible in something as routine as a restaurant meal, maybe we can inspire other people to look for those possibilities in their own lives. David reached across the table and picked up Maya's notebook, flipping through pages of observations and ideas and sketches of possibility. You know what this reminds me of? He said finally. What? That umbrella you gave me. You didn't know me, didn't know what it might lead to, didn't calculate the potential return on investment. You just saw someone who needed something you had, and you gave it freely. This project feels like that same impulse, but scaled up. You're offering to give 3 years of your life to an experiment that might not work, because you believe human connection matters more than personal security. Maya felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from the recognition that David understood not just her proposal, but the values that motivated it. So you'll support it, even though it's risky and unconventional and might not produce the kind of immediate results that corporate investors usually want to see? Maya, David said, closing her notebook and meeting her eyes with the same intensity she'd noticed on that first night. 6 months ago, I was a successful businessman who'd forgotten why success was supposed to matter. You reminded me that the most valuable currency isn't money. It's the ability to see other people clearly and choose kindness even when it's inconvenient. If you're willing to spend 3 years proving that principle can transform entire communities, then I'm willing to bet everything I've built on supporting you. Maya felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that this conversation was marking the beginning of something larger than either of them had imagined when David first walked into Romano's looking for a quiet place to eat dinner alone. They were committing to an experiment that would test whether authenticity could be scaled, whether kindness could be systematized, whether the simple act of seeing people as individuals could revolutionize how businesses operated. There's one more. The thing, Maya said, reaching into her purse and pulling out the resignation letter she'd never submitted. I want to keep this, not because I'm planning to use it, but as a reminder of where I was 6 months ago. Sometimes we need evidence of how much we've changed, proof that transformation is possible even when it feels impossible. David smiled, and Maya saw in his expression the same mixture of hope and determination she felt in her own heart. I still have your umbrella, he said. Same reason. Some gifts are too important to return, even when they've served their original purpose. Maya looked around the dining room of Romano's, at the tables where she'd served thousands of meals, the windows where she'd watched countless human dramas unfold, the space where she'd learned that invisibility was a choice rather than an inevitability. In a few weeks, she'd begin the first phase of her new role, traveling to Romano's locations across the Pacific Northwest to discover what authentic community engagement looked like in different contexts. But right now, sitting at table 4 with someone who'd transformed from a lonely customer into a collaborative partner in reimagining what business could be, Maya felt the profound satisfaction of knowing she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly the work that mattered most. "When do we start?" she asked. "How about today?" David replied. "I know 17 restaurant managers who are about to learn that their most important job isn't maximizing profit margins. It's creating spaces where people feel seen and valued and connected to something larger than themselves." Maya laughed, remembering the shy server who'd once been afraid to submit a resignation letter, who'd hidden behind invisibility because being seen felt too dangerous. That person felt like a character from someone else's story now, someone she remembered, fondly but no longer needed to be. As they left Romano's together, Maya caught sight of her reflection in the front window and realized she was smiling the same smile she'd worn on that snowy night when she'd given away her umbrella. It was the smile of someone who'd discovered that the best things in life happened when you stopped calculating costs and started giving freely, when you chose connection over protection, when you remembered that kindness was always possible, even in the most ordinary moments. The story that had begun with a simple act of compassion between strangers was becoming something neither of them could have predicted. A blueprint for transforming not just restaurants, but entire communities, one genuine interaction at a time. And Maya knew that somewhere in cities she hadn't yet visited, there were servers waiting to learn that their work mattered, customers hoping to feel less alone, and countless small moments where choosing kindness over efficiency could change everything. The umbrella had been returned to its giver in the form of opportunity, and the gift was multiplying in ways that would ripple outward for years to come, touching lives that Maya and David would never know about, but would always be connected to through the simple decision to believe that human connection was worth any risk. If this story of transformation through unexpected kindness has touched your heart, remember that every day offers chances to be someone's umbrella, to offer shelter, comfort, or simply the recognition that they matter. Sometimes the smallest gestures create the largest changes, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is see someone clearly and choose compassion. Thank you for staying with Maya and David's journey to the end, where quiet truths often echo the loudest. If their story reminded you that authenticity and kindness can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can keep sharing stories that heal and inspire, one genuine connection at a time.